There's a phase every empath goes through that feels almost like a curse. You walk into a room and instantly feel everything: tension, insecurity, hidden resentment, unspoken sadness, and none of it belongs to you, yet somehow it becomes yours. You carry it, process it, and often try to fix it. For a long time, this feels like compassion. It feels like connection. But in reality, it's a lack of separation. It's the absence of a boundary between where you end and someone else begins. And this is where the transformation starts. A healed empath doesn't lose their sensitivity. That's the common misconception. They don't become cold, detached, or indifferent. What changes is far more precise and far more powerful. They develop what you could call emotional authority, not control over others, but control over their relationship to what they feel. Before healing, empathy is reactive. It's automatic. Someone is anxious and your body mirrors it. Someone is angry and your nervous system absorbs it. You don't choose this, it happens instantly, below conscious awareness. And because it feels so real, you assume it must be yours to deal with. So you step in, you soothe, you fix, you overextend. And slowly, without realizing it, you build a life where your internal state is dictated by external people. But healing interrupts that pattern. It introduces a small but critical gap between what you feel and what you do with it. And in that gap, something new emerges: discernment. You begin to recognize that feeling something doesn't automatically mean you have to carry it. You can witness without absorbing. You can understand without internalizing. This is not detachment in the unhealthy sense. It's clarity. Think about the difference between standing in a storm and watching one through a window. Before healing, you're in the storm. Every emotional shift around you hits directly. After healing, the storm doesn't disappear, you just step out of it. You can still see it. You can still understand its intensity, but you're no longer being battered by it. And that changes everything, because once you stop absorbing, you stop reacting impulsively. You stop trying to manage other people's emotions as a way to regulate your own. You start asking better questions. Is this mine? Becomes a filter. Am I responsible for this? Becomes a boundary. And most importantly, what is the appropriate response here? Replaces the old instinct of immediate emotional labor. This is where empathy evolves from a burden into a skill. A healed empath can walk into that same room, feel the same tension, and not be controlled by it. They can read the emotional landscape with accuracy, but instead of merging with it, they analyze it. They choose how to engage, if at all. And that choice is where their power lies. Because when you're no longer overwhelmed, you become strategic. You start to notice patterns you couldn't see before. You recognize when someone is projecting, when someone is seeking validation, when someone is testing boundaries. And instead of reacting emotionally, you respond intentionally. Sometimes that response is compassion. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's distance. But it's always chosen, not triggered. This shift also changes how people experience you. Before, others might have been drawn to your openness, but they also sensed your availability or willingness to take on more than you should. And whether consciously or unconsciously, people tend to lean into that. After healing, that dynamic changes. You're still empathetic, but there's a structure to it. There's a presence that says, I understand you, but I'm not here to carry you. And that creates respect. Not because you demand it loudly, but because your energy communicates it clearly. There's a steadiness to you, a groundedness. You're no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos, and that makes you both more effective and more selective in how you engage. It's important to understand that this doesn't happen overnight. For many empaths, this shift feels uncomfortable at first. There's guilt. There's a sense of, I should be doing more. That's because your identity has been built around being the one who absorbs, who fixes, who gives endlessly. Letting go of that role can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you're actually losing is the part that was unsustainable. What replaces it is something far more stable. You begin to realize that true empathy isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about accurate understanding combined with appropriate action. And sometimes the most appropriate action is to do nothing, to allow others to experience their own emotions without interference. This is where emotional authority fully takes hold. You're no longer at the mercy of every emotional signal around you. You become the filter, the interpreter, the decision maker. Your empathy becomes intentional rather than automatic. And because of that, it becomes far more impactful. When you do choose to engage, it's focused, it's measured, it's effective. You're not drained at the end of the day. You're not overwhelmed by interactions. You're not carrying conversations in your mind long after they've ended. You move through environments with awareness, but also with protection. Not walls, just clarity about what belongs to you and what doesn't. And once you reach this point, something subtle but profound happens. You stop fearing your own sensitivity. You stop seeing it as something that makes you vulnerable. Instead, you recognize it as a form of intelligence, one that, when disciplined, gives you insight most people never develop. You don't shut off your empathy, you refine it, and that refinement is what turns it from something that once controlled you into something that now works for you. Because the moment you realize you can feel everything without carrying anything is the moment you stop being overwhelmed by the world and start understanding it. There's a moment in an empath's life where they begin to realize that what they once called kindness was, in many cases, a lack of boundaries. Not intentional, not malicious, just unexamined. They gave because it felt right. They tolerated because they understood. They stayed because they could see the pain behind someone's behavior. And for a long time, that felt like strength. But over time, the pattern reveals its cost. When you operate without clear boundaries, your identity becomes shaped by other people's expectations. You start anticipating needs that were never expressed. You start saying yes before you've even checked in with yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you start believing that your value is tied to how much you can endure, how much you can give, and how much you can fix. Healing disrupts that belief system at its core. A healed empath comes to a very uncomfortable realization. Love without boundaries is not noble self-erasure. It creates relationships where one person is consistently overextended and the other becomes often unintentionally dependent on that overextension. And the longer that dynamic continues, the harder it becomes to break because it starts to feel like identity. This is just who I am. But it isn't who you are. It's what you've practiced. And what's been practiced can be changed. The shift begins when the empath starts to redefine responsibility. Before healing, there's an unspoken rule. If I can help, I should help. After healing, that rule becomes more precise. If it is mine to carry, I will carry it. If it is not, I will let it remain where it belongs. That distinction is subtle, but it's transformative. Because once you understand that not everything requires your involvement, you begin to reclaim your time, your energy, and your emotional stability. Boundaries in this context are not barriers, they're filters. They determine what enters your space and what doesn't. They define what you will engage with and what you will step away from. And most importantly, they remove the assumption that access to you is unlimited. This is where many empaths struggle initially because they've been conditioned to associate boundaries with rejection. Saying no feels like hurting someone. Pulling back feels like abandonment. But that's because the frame has been distorted. Boundaries are not an act of aggression, they're an act of clarity. They communicate something very simple. This is where I end, and this is where you begin. A healed empath learns to express this without apology, not with hostility, not with defensiveness, but with calm certainty. There's no need to over-explain, no need to justify every decision. The boundary stands on its own because it's rooted in self-respect rather than fear. And this is where the real power emerges. When your no becomes clear and consistent, people begin to adjust. Some will respect it immediately. Others may test it, especially if they've benefited from your lack of boundaries in the past. That testing is not a sign that your boundary is wrong, it's a sign that it's new. And consistency is what solidifies it. Over time, something interesting happens. The relationships that relied on your overextension begin to fade or transform. The ones that remain are built on mutual respect, not silent obligation. You're no longer the person who absorbs everything and asks for nothing. You become someone who engages intentionally, who gives without depletion, and who receives without guilt. This also changes your internal landscape. Before, there was a constant low-level tension, a sense that you were always slightly behind, always slightly overwhelmed, always carrying more than you should. After boundaries are established, that tension begins to dissolve. There's space where there used to be pressure. There's clarity where there used to be confusion. You start to notice how much of your previous stress wasn't coming from life itself, but from you. Inability to say no to what wasn't aligned with you. And once you see that, it becomes very difficult to go back. Because boundaries don't just protect your energy, they refine your life. They force you to prioritize. They force you to decide what actually matters and what doesn't. And in doing so, they eliminate a significant amount of noise. You're no longer reacting to everything. You're choosing what deserves your attention. This doesn't make you less compassionate. It makes your compassion more effective. Instead of spreading yourself thin across every situation, you're able to focus your energy where it can actually make a difference. You're no longer helping out of obligation or guilt, you're helping out of alignment. And that difference is felt both by you and by others. There's also a philosophical shift that occurs here. You begin to understand that every person is responsible for their own emotional experience. You can support, you can guide, you can listen, but you cannot live someone else's life for them. And trying to do so doesn't help them. It prevents them from developing their own capacity to handle challenges. So, in a paradoxical way, your boundaries don't just protect you, they also serve others. They create an environment where accountability can exist, where people are encouraged to step into their own responsibility rather than relying on you to carry it for them. And that's a far more sustainable form of connection. A healed empath doesn't withdraw from the world. They simply stop over-participating in it. They recognize that their energy is finite, and they treat it accordingly. They give, but not endlessly. They listen, but not at the cost of themselves. They engage, but only where it's appropriate. And perhaps most importantly, they no longer feel the need to be everything for everyone, because they understand something that changes everything. Your capacity to care does not obligate you to sacrifice yourself. There's a subtle but profound shift that happens once an empath has moved through the earlier stages of healing. After learning to separate what they feel from what they carry, they begin to understand the true nature of their situation. And after establishing boundaries that protect their time and energy, something else begins to sharpen something quieter, but far more precise. Their perception changes. Before healing, an empath often sees the best in people. Not because they're naive, but because they're attuned to potential. They can sense the underlying pain, the unspoken wounds, the version of someone that exists beneath their behavior. And because of that, they tend to interpret actions through a lens of compassion. Red flags are noticed, but then explained away. Inconsistencies are felt, but then rationalized. The story becomes more important than the evidence. And this is where many empaths lose themselves. Because when you prioritize potential over pattern, you end up investing in who someone could be, rather than who they consistently show themselves to. B. You become patient where you should be cautious. You become understanding where you should be discerning. And over time, that creates a gap between reality and perception. Healing closes that gap. A healed empath doesn't lose their ability to see depth in others, but they stop allowing that depth to override observable behavior. They begin to recognize that intention and impact are not the same thing. Someone may not intend to manipulate, but if the pattern results in manipulation, the effect is still real. Someone may have a difficult past, but that doesn't grant them unlimited access to your present. This is where discernment replaces assumption. You start paying attention to patterns, not promises, to consistency, not intensity. You observe how someone behaves over time, especially in moments of stress, disagreement, or limitation. Because those moments reveal far more than words ever will. And what's interesting is that this ability was always there. It was just overshadowed by the impulse to empathize first and evaluate later. Healing reverses that sequence. You still empathize, but only after you've assessed what you're actually dealing with. This creates a form of clarity that can feel almost uncomfortable at first. You begin to see things you used to miss, subtle contradictions in how someone presents themselves, the difference between genuine vulnerability and strategic disclosure, the way certain people shift their behavior depending on what they want. None of this requires suspicion or paranoia, it's simply observation without distortion. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is why a healed empath becomes very difficult to manipulate. Not because they're guarded or closed off, but because they no longer ignore the data in front of them. Emotional intelligence at this level is not just about feeling, it's about pattern recognition. It's about connecting behavior across time and identifying what is consistent versus what is situational. For example, someone might be incredibly attentive at the beginning of a relationship. They listen, they engage, they show interest, but over time, that attentiveness becomes inconsistent. It appears when they need something and disappears when they don't. Before healing, an empath might interpret the initial intensity as proof of character and dismiss the inconsistency as temporary. After healing, they reverse that. They recognize that consistency defines character, not isolated moments. And that recognition changes how they respond. They don't confront everything. They don't need to. Often, they simply adjust their level of access. They invest less where there is less stability. They step back where there is ambiguity. They allow behavior to inform their decisions rather than words. This creates a kind of quiet control not over others, but over their own involvement. Another important shift happens here as well. A healed empath stops taking everything personally. When you understand patterns, you realize that most behavior is not about wits, about the other person's habits, conditioning, and unresolved issues. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it contextualizes it. It allows you to respond without internalizing, and that's a significant form of freedom. Because when you stop personalizing everything, you stop overcorrecting. You stop trying to fix yourself in response to someone else's inconsistency. You stop asking, what did I do wrong? And start asking, what is this pattern showing me? That question leads to better decisions. You begin to trust your observations. You begin to act earlier rather than waiting for confirmation through repeated disappointment. And most importantly, you begin to respect your own perception instead of overriding it to maintain harmony. This doesn't make you cynical, it makes you accurate. There's a difference between expecting the worst and recognizing what is. A healed empath doesn't assume negative intent, but they also don't ignore negative patterns. They hold both awareness and openness at the same time. They can see clearly without becoming closed. And this is where their presence changes in a noticeable way. They become harder to read, not because they're hiding, but because they're no longer reacting predictably. They don't respond to manipulation in the way they once did. They don't engage in emotional games. And because of that, people who rely on those dynamics tend to lose interest quickly. There's nothing to hook into. At the same time, people who value clarity and consistency are drawn in. Because a healed empath offers something rare attention that is both deep and discerning. They listen, but they also evaluate. They connect, but they also choose. And that choice is what defines this stage. You are no longer navigating relationships based on hope or assumption. You are navigating based on evidence, pattern, and alignment. You don't need to control outcomes because your decisions are informed. You trust yourself to see what's there, not what you wish were there. And once that trust is established, something shifts internally. There's less hesitation, less second guessing, less emotional turbulence. You move with a kind of quiet certainty, because your perception is no longer clouded by the need to make things work. You simply see and then you decide. And that is the moment where empathy and intelligence fully integrate, where feeling and reasoning are no longer in conflict but in cooperation, where your ability to understand people is matched by your ability to respond appropriately. Because in the end, the goal is not to see more, it's to see clearly and have the discipline to act on what you see. There's a point in the evolution of an empath where the external world starts to look very different, not because the world has changed, but because their relationship to it has. Earlier in life, connection often feels like something you pursue. You reach for it, you invest in it quickly, and you sometimes confuse intensity with authenticity. Being around people, being needed, being emotionally involved, these things can easily become substitutes for stability. But once an empath has gone through real internal restructuring, something fundamental shifts. They stop chasing connection and start evaluating it. And that shift can look from the outside like withdrawal. People might assume they've become distant, less social, even detached. But that interpretation misses what's actually happening. It's not withdrawal from people, it's withdrawal from dependency, from overexposure, from environments that demand emotional labor without reciprocity. A healed empath doesn't become isolated, they become selective. And selection changes everything. Because when you are no longer driven by the need to be understood, validated, or included, your tolerance for misaligned environments drops dramatically. You begin to notice not just how people treat you, but how you feel after interacting with them. Do you feel expanded or depleted, clear or confused, grounded or scattered? These internal signals become more important than social obligation. And that's where solitude enters not as punishment, but as preference. Solitude for a healed empath is not loneliness, it's regulation. It's the space where their nervous system resets, where their thoughts organize, where emotional noise settles. In solitude, they are not performing, adapting, or absorbing. They are simply existing without external interference. And after years of emotional overload, that state becomes not just comfortable but essential. But there's an important distinction here. This isn't isolation driven by fear or avoidance. It's not about shutting people out. It's about no longer forcing connection where it doesn't naturally exist. A healed empath understands something most people overlook. Not all connection is beneficial. Some relationships are built on imbalance. Some are maintained through habit rather than alignment. And some persist simply because one person is overfunctioning emotionally while the other underfunctions. When you remove overfunctioning from that equation, many of those connections naturally dissolve. And what remains is much smaller but far more stable. This is where the idea of a smaller circle becomes meaningful. It's not about rejecting people, it's about refining proximity. Not everyone is meant to have equal access to your emotional world. Some people are acquaintances, some are situational connections, and only a few are truly aligned at the level of trust, respect, and emotional reciprocity. A healed empath stops treating all connections as if they belong in the same category. And that alone reduces a tremendous amount of internal conflict, because a large part of emotional exhaustion comes from misallocation. Giving deep energy to shallow connections, expecting depth from people who are only capable of surface level interaction, trying to create intimacy in environments that were never structured for it. Once that pattern is recognized, it becomes unsustainable to continue it. So the empath begins to recalibrate. They invest more slowly. They observe longer before opening up. They allow relationships to prove themselves through time, consistency, and behavior, not through words, chemistry, or initial resonance. This creates a natural filtering effect. Many connections never progress past the surface. And that's not seen as loss, it's seen as accuracy, because clarity replaces hope. At the same time, something important happens internally. The fear of being alone starts to dissolve. Not because the empath stops valuing connection, but because they stop confusing presence with stability. They realize that being surrounded by people does not guarantee emotional safety. In fact, in many cases, solitude is less draining than performative connection. And once that is understood, the emotional pressure to maintain unnecessary relationships disappears. This is where independence becomes real, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. A healed empath no longer organizes their life around availability. They don't rearrange themselves to fit into inconsistent dynamics. They don't overextend to maintain access to people who are only partially present. Instead, they allow space for relationships to exist at their natural level of alignment. And what's interesting is that this creates a paradox. The less they chase connection, the more meaningful connection becomes available to them. Because authenticity cannot coexist with desperation. When you are no longer trying to force belonging, you begin to attract relationships that are not based on need, but on mutual recognition. There's also a shift in emotional identity here. Earlier, many empaths unconsciously define themselves through relational roles: the helper, the listener, the one who understands. But in this stage, identity becomes less dependent on what they provide to others and more grounded in who they are when nothing is being demanded of them. That change is subtle but profound, because when you are no longer performing a role in every interaction, you begin to experience yourself outside of utility. You are not just someone who absorbs, fixes, or supports you, are someone who exists independently of those functions. And that realization creates stability. It also creates boundaries without effort. You don't need to constantly enforce limits when your life is no longer structured around over-accessibility. You simply become less reachable in the ways that previously drained you. Not out of avoidance, but out of alignment. And in that space, something often overlooked begins to emerge: peace. Not the temporary relief that comes from escaping conflict, but a deeper form of steadiness, the kind that doesn't require constant emotional adjustment, the kind that isn't disrupted by every interaction, the kind that allows you to move through life without being pulled in multiple emotional directions at once. That is what selective connection creates. And at its highest expression, this is not loneliness, it is sovereignty. Because sovereignty is not about being separate from others. It's about not being internally dependent on their presence to feel stable. It's the ability to be fully yourself, whether you are alone or with others, without fragmentation. A healed empath reaches that point not by closing off, but by refining access. Not by rejecting connection, but by choosing it deliberately. Not by withdrawing from life, but by stepping out of emotional chaos and into intentional engagement. And when that happens, something becomes very clear. They are no longer trying to find where they belong. They are deciding where they will allow themselves to be fully present. And that changes everything. Because once you stop needing connection to define you, you finally gain the freedom to choose it in. Its most honest form, and that is where real peace begins.